Hi, this is Dan Korver, pastor here at Dalton Hill Baptist Church. We're a small Baptist church located in Owasso, Oklahoma. We're small enough to know you, but we're big enough to serve you and for you to serve as well. Our vision is to rescue, restore, and return to service. Rescue a non-believer or a believer who has been hurt or is lost, restoring them to Christ and fellowship with other believers with the desire that they in turn will help others along their way.
We've been going through I told you a while back, I started a series on Paul, and I have not ever done it because of how massive it is. So I said a couple weeks ago we had 2 weeks left, so this will be one, and then we'll finish next week. And if you remember the setting, if you stop and you think about it, what happens, the reason I think we can relate, how many of you have had some close calls with death? I think some of you have had, look at Don Stennett, he goes in with, he got a massive heart attack here and should have died. You know, we also have Marilyn and just about got killed with where she was at. You know, Bob has a heart attack. Don Stennett goes in for his knee and it finds out he has problems with his heart and other things. A lot of you could say similar things. If you stop and think about with Paul, you look about the last 5 years of Paul that we had talked about. He was imprisoned in Caesarea for 2 years, and they were trying the Jews to kill him. Then you have the 6 month journey to Rome. You get bit by the poisonous viper. You have a shipwreck. You then go to Rome on house arrest for 2 years. So basically 4.5 years of your life or more is spent with that. And now you're released. What would you do when you're released? So what Paul does, he goes and he travels, but he writes 2 letters. He writes 2 letters to individuals. It's interesting, if Philemon was the last letter that he wrote while he was in prison, you realize every letter he wrote before was to churches, but the last 4 he wrote were to individuals. So when you stop and think about it, Paul can feel that way. You know, if you wanted a title, how about released, but recognize the end is approaching. How many of you feel that way? When you look in the mirror and you realize the end is approaching. It's like I've said, I have more and more people at work on both East and West Refinery. When they see me now, call me OD. Old Dan.
Oh my gosh. You're not old.
Seriously, like East and West walk by and it happened to me twice this last week. Hey OD, how's it going? I was feeling pretty good. But that's true for a lot of us. You stop and you think about it. So what would you do? I think Paul recognizes with what he's been through, he realizes he's got a new lease on life, but he realizes time's approaching. So who would you write and what would you write? So I think he writes to Timothy. And let's look at some of the things he's writing to Timothy in the book of 1 Timothy. I'm mainly interested in just what he's writing to him personally. So released but recognizing the end is approaching. Look in chapter 1 and see if this wouldn't fit for a lot of us. Notice in verse 18 to 20, the first one, remain in the battle. Because we think about it, Paul's been gone from the scene for 5 years. How many people, if you look at the other epistles, you'll find a number of them have fallen out, have quit. Look what he writes in verse 18. This commandment I entrust to you, Timothy, my son, in accordance with the prophecies previously made concerning you, that by them, notice, you may fight the good fight. So, how many of us are in a battle and we need to keep fighting? We agree we're in a battle, we need to keep fighting. And also, that's the past. You've been fighting a good fight, Timothy? But notice what he tells him to do now. Keeping faith and a good conscience. How many people are keeping the faith and a good conscience? You notice he outwrites about 2 of them who are shipwrecked. How many Christians do you know have been shipwrecked? You look back on your life and having gone back and have thought about it, you know, talking with Stephen this last week. It was 50 years ago this December that he and I went on our first double date with Jane and son. 50 years. He took Linda, and we worked all day, and he took Linda on a date, and I took Jean. And I think it's interesting, but how many people that we went to school with have fallen along the wayside? Huge, huge number. What about here? He's thinking about with Timothy, you know, I'm not maybe not to be here much longer. Timothy, I don't want you to be like these two men here and fall. So he wants you to remain in the battle. Notice the possibilities. He talks about these two, but the way you're going to do it is keeping faith and a good conscience. How many find it hard to walk by faith? You know, Colossians 2 and verse 7, as you have come to know him, so walking in him. You know, it's like looking in a mirror. Doesn't it not say in Isaiah 55, you know, his thoughts are higher than our thoughts, his ways higher than ours? How many of you tried to figure out God's way? How well does it work? We don't understand. But what we do have to do is we need to remain in the battle. Wherever that is, and that can change in a lot of different things. You may be retired, you may be whatever, but you're still in service for Him. If He's left you on this earth, He gave you a gift, He still expects you to use it. One person I greatly admire, Gene and I, he's actually been here and gave his testimony. I think he's 93 now. How many of you remember Onus Meyer when he came and spoke? Onus Meyer is 93. When he came, he was in the Korean War, which was 50 to 53. He was pinned down in a rock quarry, and they had him against the north, and they had him surrounded. It was moonlight was out, and you know, you against all of the ones out there firing at you. How many of you would start praying? He started praying, Lord, if you'll get me out of this, I promise I'll serve you the rest of my life. And he was and he still is, a crack shot. And he, by seeing their fire, he could see where the enemy was and was able to get one. But then God miraculously, after he prayed, brought a cloud cover where they could not see him, and he was able to get out in between without them being able to see. Now, how would you like to walk knowing they're all around you? Now you get back to the States, what are you going to do? He has taught Sunday school, or taught, for the last 70 years.
Wow.
Every church he's been at. Well, now he's at a nursing home. He is still teaching every week. Others at the nursing home with him. Why? Because he gave God His word. He's still in the fight. And I think it's interesting that he can't do other things, but he can do that, and he's still doing it. So notice, I think it's interesting, remain in the battle. So all of us, we have different ways, we have different places we can serve, but remain in the battle. Notice in chapter 4, something else he tells us to do. Chapter 4 in verse 6, besides remain in the battle, notice we need to refresh ourselves. Notice how we're supposed to do it. In verse 6, chapter 4, verse 6. In pointing out these things to the brethren, you'll be good servants of Christ Jesus. Notice what it says. Constantly nourished on the word of faith and of sound doctrine which you have been following. Notice refreshing yourself. How do you refresh yourself? Notice constantly nourished faith, sound doctrine. How many people are malnourished as Christians? He's telling Timothy, you need to be constantly nourishing yourself. And I think what happens, you can get so busy serving the Lord that you starve to death. And I think it's interesting. So again, how many of us are doing it? We're told when to do it, we're told where to do it, we're told why to do it. We need to be getting the nourishment. It reminds me a lot, if you remember when Saul was going to kill Jonathan, you remember? Because he took food. Remember, Jonathan said we would have had a much greater battle had the rest of them been able to eat, but they were too tired from not having eaten anything. Our victory wasn't as great as it could have. Since you're there, turn over, if you would, just for a minute to Mark chapter 6. Jesus sends out the disciples. You remember, he sends them out 2 by 2. It's also interesting how he does it. He needs the accountability and to help each other along the way. And they come back to report to him, Mark chapter 6. And they come back to report all they are going to in verse 30. Notice what Jesus said. 6:31. And Jesus said to them, the disciples, the apostles, "Come away by yourselves to a lonely place and rest a while. For there were so many people coming and going, they didn't even have time to eat." Who recognized they needed a rest? Jesus did. You notice they didn't go over. Jesus basically had to order them to. Sometimes other people can recognize it, but I think it's interesting. We need to refresh ourselves both in the Word of God every day. Prayer, Word of God. But we also need to get away just for your mental and physical. It's interesting. When did Elijah fall apart? After he had the great deal with the Baal worshippers. Remember, he flees after Jezebel threatens to kill him. And remember his statement, "I alone am left." And God had to correct him and say, "No, there's 6,000 others." I think it often can be that way. Be really a time when we need to get away to rest. And I think it's interesting when you think about it. Glenn mentioned it on Wednesday night, but the Shulamite woman. You ever think that her name was never mentioned? Shulamite means that's where she's from, which is 7 miles east of Megiddo. So from the Sea of Galilee going towards the Mediterranean Sea, basically halfway in between. All we know is where she's from. We don't know her husband's name. We don't know her name. But what did she do for Elisha? Remember, he's going between the different cities, and she and her husband provide him a place to do what? To get away to rest. How important was that place to Elisha? So much so that he wants to then bless her later. I know Grady was telling me about a place up in Montana a few years back where they have it where pastors can go for a very reduced rate to be away for their family. It's great when you have places like that, but we all need a time to refresh. I often used to hear it said, you're either going to wear out or rust out. The problem with either one is you're still out. Seriously. You're still out. And so you need people who are still in, not rusting out. And it's a lot like a football game, right? 22 people in desperate need of rest and 70,000 in desperate need of exercise. And there's a lot of truth to that too. But we don't need either or. So we have it. We need to remain in the battle. We need to refresh ourselves. And so you might look at what you ate this last week. What did you eat this last week? When it comes to your spiritual things, what did you eat? If you didn't eat anything, it may have a reflect. You may be able to say, this is why I'm struggling. The third thing I think is interesting, since you're in chapter 4, notice down in verse 12 through 16, the role reminder. They think about it, Timothy would probably be in his 40 or whatever. Let no one look down on your youthfulness. How many times do people look down on your age? Pro or con? I have a new boss. Just started this week. He's 25 years younger than I am. Okay? But he knows all kinds of regulations I know absolutely nothing about, so I'll let him do all that. But, we can easily look down on somebody's age. Either way. Notice what he says then, what he wants you to do. Rather, in speech, conduct, love, faith, and purity, show yourself to be exempt. It doesn't matter if you're 20 Or if you're 80, have them look at you in all these areas and you will set the example. I think it's interesting what he tells them. Don't worry about what other people think about it, by your age. You do these things, your role. So notice, I think, one, he tells you to be an example for people to follow. How many of you love to have people tell you what to do and show you as well, and you truly can follow them? Notice what he also wants them to do. He wants them to give public reading and exhortation, but notice in verse 14, don't neglect the spiritual gift within you. How many times can you be serving and after a while you just want to quit? I don't want to use I'm just tired. Right now, if you do a lot of things for the Lord, you can easily get publicly attacked on anything. You hold most anything from scriptural today and you'll get a public attack. Pete, have you ever been set up? When people already know how you feel and they'll publicly ask you a question because they want to set you up. Notice his role. Hey, be an example where people want to follow you. Exercise your gift. And then notice what he tells you, I think it's in 15 and 16, take pains with those things, be absorbed in them, so that all your progress may be evident to all. The word there for progress, I think Errol would like this. It's a military term. Military advancement. If you have a military advancement, how many people are going to know? You look at Ukraine and Russia. With one advancing either direction, are we going to know about it? It's going to be out on public TV. When people look at our life, can they see an advancement in our Christian life? It ought to be obvious to everyone. If I'm doing what I should be doing, people will see it. And it's interesting, he says, pay close attention to yourself. All of us are always pointing out what everybody else ought to do. And he's saying, pay attention to yourself and do it. So notice we're supposed to remain in the battle. We're supposed to refresh ourselves. The role reminder. It's interesting, since we're talking about the two letters he wrote, Timothy and then also Titus. He writes similar something to Titus about the role. So let's turn over to Titus. We'll just look at one passage in Titus, then we'll be back in Timothy. In chapter 2 of Titus and chapter 3, he uses one word 3 times. It's interesting. Notice in chapter 2 and verse 1. Writing to Titus. Remember, Titus is at Crete. Paul is at, and Timothy is at Ephesus. Notice what he tells Titus. But as for you, Titus, speak the things which are fitting for sound doctrine. Okay, then go down a little bit further. What about verse 15? These things speak and exhort and reprove with all authority. Let no one disregard you. Let's speak again. Notice chapter 3 and verse 8. This is a trustworthy statement concerning these things. I want you to speak confidently. You ever stop and look? Each time he's telling Titus to do what? Speak up. Speak the truth. How many people today want to hear biblical truth? And how easy is it for us just not to say anything? Timothy, you need to speak up and you have a role and be able to follow. Titus, you likewise need to speak up. Paul won't be around much longer. They're the future. What are they going to do? So I think it's interesting. How many of us could write like Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 11 and verse 1? Imitate me as I what? Imitate Christ. That's interesting. Guys, I want you to imitate me. And what I say, what I do, everything else. He does the same thing in Philippians. What you've seen and heard and seen to me, practice these things. Okay, so you have to remain in the battle, refresh yourself. You have a role reminder. Chapter 5 then of 1 Timothy. Verse 21 and 22. We need to recognize others carefully. Notice he says in verse 21, I solemnly charge you in the presence of God and of Christ Jesus. And of his chosen angels, well, that'd be quite an audience, wouldn't it? Who's all witnessing this? God, Jesus, and his angels. To maintain these principles without bias, doing nothing in the spirit of partiality. We ever have any trouble with partiality? Notice what he says then. Don't lay hands upon anyone too hastily and thus share the responsibility of sins of others. Keep yourself free from sin. You know, I've often been asked, was even this last week, a couple of times, do you know if so-and-so, you recommend, whatever line of field or whatever it might be. Well, the difficulty is when you recommend them, and people are going on your recommendation, what happens if it turns out that it's not good? I remember when I came to work here, as well as the refinery, I gave up a lot of yards. Gave up 40-something yards. And so customers wanted to know who to get. And I had someone that offered to buy the yards from me, and they were going to take it over. I said, okay. I had seen their work, and they did nice work. I said, okay, well, don't raise the price for anything for at least a year. I agree. Well, you had 15 on one block. Now think about it. When you have a crew and you have 15 on one block, you have 9 around the corner on another block, how much windshield time do you have?
None.
You pull up with a crew of 4 and you're there how much of the day?
All day long.
And you're making straight money. Well, what does he do? He raises the price on every one of them. Everyone quitting except for one. So now he comes up, does 1 yard for $5 more, loads up a crew of 4, and where does he go?
Across town.
Windshield time going all around the pan. Well, he did a lawyer that I worked for, is retired now, did his yard. Well, whenever I would aerate or seed, I would be real reasonable to him. Well, how many of you would know what your square footage is of your yard? So he tells his wife, okay, I'll aerate and seed your yard for X amount per square foot. That's how most people do it. But a little bit of yard, they got a bill for $700 and something. Okay? Now I did it for twice the price of a yard. $100 for seed. The person does it in a little over an hour, and how much money did they make? Now, if you're the lawyer, how many of you are mad when you see the bill? Who are you going to call? Dan? Hey, So when you're recommending somebody, you got to be careful. You have to be careful. And I've had the same thing happens or anything. So if you don't know somebody real well, you don't want to recommend. I know a good mechanic, so I recommend him. And he treats him well. But by the same time, you want to be careful on who you talk to. But the same thing, we have to do the same thing what we do. Notice, I think it's interesting in chapter 6 of 1 Timothy. Notice in verse 11 of chapter 6. What he tells them to do is to remain true. Notice in verse 10, but flee from these things. So what are these things? You have to go to the previous verses. Go up at verse 6. But godliness actually is a means of great gain when accompanied by contentment. How many Christians are content? You notice he then starts talking about money, and how many times has financial things misguided so many Christians, fallen off into a lot of things. How many Christians are not content? Paul looked in chapter 4 of Philippians, says, I've learned to be content. Godliness and contentment. Be thankful for what God has given, but how many of us are always one more thing, one more thing, one more thing? And what he's telling us to do here is to remain true. Be content with what God's given you. Doesn't mean you don't have a different house or whatever it might be, a different car. But don't make that the only thing you have contentment, because you can then compromise. Interesting too, second part of verse 11. and pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, love, perseverance, and gentleness. So when you get to chapter 2 in verse 22 of 2 Timothy, he says to do the same thing with those who are of like-minded. How many of us do our companions have any bearing on us? Who we associate with. 1 Corinthians 15:33, bad company does what? Corrupts good morals. Proverbs 24, if you are around a person given the anger, you're going to be what?
Just like him.
Just like him. So notice when he says to remain true, our contentment, but then also is, who do we associate with? Who do we listen to? It's amazing when you listen to different people and you talk to people at work or anything else, and just by talking to them for a little while, you can pretty much tell, I can pretty much tell you which radio station or TV station they listen to. It's just amazing how we can get influenced by so many things, whatever it might be. It's interesting, notice when he goes down, notice the conduct. Look in verse 12. Fight the good fight of faith. How did he start chapter 1? Fight the good fight. How does he end it? Fight the good fight, but he adds what? Faith. How many times is faith so... if it hasn't happened in your life, it's going to, and you're not going to understand why God's doing what he does. Sometimes later you'll realize it and you'll make sense. Many times it will not make sense. That's why we have to trust him. We have to trust him. And notice, fight the good fight. Notice in verse 14. Keep the commandment without stain or reproach. So who should we be comparing ourselves to? Jesus. And who do we usually compare ourselves to? All people. Yeah, I look up against Daniel. He's kind of yellow looking, so hey, I'm better off than what he is. You don't realize that we've been doing quite a bit of painting in our house and doing different stuff. And we have a color called Free Spirit we've used for 30-some years, actually about 45 years, from a customer in Alabama. Well, it's white, but it has a little bit of cream or yellow. Well, what happens when sunlight and things happen to it? Discolors and looks very yellow. But when you gradually, you don't really notice. Then all of a sudden you put white up next to it and what? Okay, notice who we're supposed to be without stain. We're supposed to be white like who? Jesus. Be holy even as I am holy. Notice it's up to you and I. And when we do mess up, we acknowledge it and we confess it and move on. But it's interesting what happens. So begrudgingly, I've been changing the color throughout the house. Because I know what it takes to repaint all the woodwork, cabinets, and all the rest of it. A lot of work. And this old body, when it gets down, it doesn't like to get back good. But again, what are we looking at? What are we looking at? So we need to remain true. And I think it's interesting. How many politicians have we sent to Washington that started off one way, and over time they've compromised so much they are a skeleton of what they once stood for? But I think it's interesting. How would people look at you? Are you still the same today, following the Lord, as you were 40 years ago? They can bet and bank on whatever you're doing. I think it's good for us to be thinking about that. The last one is in verse 20. So we remain in the battle, we refresh ourselves, a role reminder, we all have a role to do, spiritual gift. We need to recognize others carefully, because our name is at stake and so is theirs. We remain true, but notice we also have a responsibility to guard. Notice in verse 20 how he ends the book. O Timothy, guard what has been entrusted to you. Paul is leaving. How many hours, literally, in days and years, has Paul been investing in Timothy and in Titus? And he's telling Timothy what? Guard it. Because what I'm giving to you, you need to give to others and entrust it. Paul will be gone. What are you doing with it? I think it's interesting when what has God entrusted you with? Has He given you a spiritual gift? If you're a believer, He has. What about your resources? What about your mind? Some of you got some pretty good minds. What are we doing with that mind? Your health. God's given you health, whatever it might be. What are we doing with what He's given me? And am I being a good steward with what He's given me?
We'd love for you to come and visit with us and fellowship with us. We're located at 8263 North Owasso Expressway, which is on the east side of Highway 169 North, between 76th and 86th Street North. We have coffee and fellowship from 8:30 to 9 Sundays, followed by Sunday school for all ages from 9 to 9:45, and our Sunday morning worship service is from 10 to 11. We likewise have a Wednesday night service for all ages from 7 to 8. Now may the Lord of peace Himself give you peace at all times, and in every way the Lord be with you all the time.